Welcome to the Test Guild Automation Podcast, where we all get together to learn more about automation and software testing, with your host, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Today we'll be talking with Tommy all about environments as a service, as well as some features of how this can help you as a tester, like using it to automate preview environments and a whole bunch of other cool features. Whether you're a tester or a developer, I think this is going to be some valuable information for you to help really speed up your software development. If you don't know, Tommy is the co-founder and CEO of Release. His team has been building scalable infrastructure for over 20 years. He's an entrepreneur, so I think he's co-founded other companies like Carwool. I believe that was acquired by TrueCar. And he also is the founder of I Am Safer. And so he has a lot of experience in this space. Really excited to dive into why he chose this particular new venture to really get into some cool technology I think you're really going to benefit from. You don't want to miss this episode. Check it out.
Please enter access code.
Hello everyone, Pandy Knight here, Automation Panda and Dev Advocate for Applitools. This coming February, from the 7th through the 11th, I'll be attending Automation Guild 2022, one of the best virtual testing conferences of the year. And I'm honored to be speaking there again. My talk is going to be real talk on cross-browser testing. Now more than ever, it's so important to make sure we're testing our apps against different devices and browsers and platforms. But to tell you the truth, cross-browser testing is a real pain in the you-know-what. So I'm going to give you straight talk on how to do it right. Strategies for picking the right browsers, considering whether you should build or buy your infrastructure, and also covering some cool ways to optimize your execution with visual testing techniques. So I'll be there. Make sure you reserve your spot as soon as possible, and I look forward to seeing you at the conference. Peace.
The Test Guild Automation Podcast is sponsored by the fantastic folks at Sauce Labs, the cloud-based test platform that helps ensure you can develop with confidence at every step from code to deployment for every framework, browser, OS, mobile device, and API. Get a free trial. Visit testguild.com/Sauce Labs and click on the exclusive sponsors section to try it for free today. Check it out. Hey, Tommy, welcome to the Guild.
Nice to meet you, Joe. Thank you for having me on.
Great to have you. Really excited to talk to you about environments today and automation of environments, which I think is clearly lacking from my experience in software development. Before we get into it, is there anything I missed in your bio that you want the Guild to know more about?
No, I'm a software developer at heart. Been building companies for the last 20 years. And in every company that I've worked at, environments are always a scarce resource. And with this company, kind of came back to what was in my DNA, and that's helping developers and test teams be more productive. And I think it's kind of like once a software engineer, always a software engineer, and it's fun to be back working in this space.
Nice. So, obviously before you start up a venture like this, you probably do some sort of research. Why did you think this was the next thing to get into that you think was a void that you can help folks with?
Well, prior to this, I was the chief technology officer at TrueCar, and environments were an incredibly difficult, missing resource within the organization. So I felt the need directly. We had a large QA team, a lot of test automation that was running, and basically only one or two environments where those tests could run, and the developers always ended up bottlenecking, waiting for that resource to get their work done. So, I felt it directly at the kind of management level, seeing how it can impact productivity, having a less than ideal number of environments for your large. We had about 200 to 300 engineers in that team over time. And so when you only have a few environments for those teams to get their work done, it's a really, really big bottleneck. And even in prior companies, in startups, when you think about that from the ground up, when you start building a CI/CD platform, you think about test automation from the beginning. I've seen a world where you have ample environments and good automation. And it was interesting to be the CTO of a public company where that didn't exist and saw what could happen if you don't have it. So I think the need, seeing it firsthand, was kind of the first reason. The second was when we went to try to solve it there, nothing existed in the market. There's tools that will help you with CI/CD. There's tools that will help you kind of build your own environment. You can declaratively create them in Terraform or other tools, but there's a lot of tooling required in order to make a team of that size really effective. So we looked in the market. And I say we as a couple of my co-founders at the time, and there really wasn't an off-the-shelf solution to it. So we were forced to build an environment management system in-house there. So, and being the buyer of a product like that, I would have bought it. If there was something off the shelf to go buy that would have saved our team, a year or two's worth of build time to get something off the ground, we just saw a big gap in the market. And as an entrepreneur and being a software developer at heart, I just felt like this is the place to go work.
Absolutely. And it's kind of a tangent. I know a lot of people always we only use open source solutions, or their company only says they use open source solutions. But if you can tell them, hey, there's a solution out here that we could purchase that's going to accelerate what we need to do it correctly, and we don't have to put in all this effort to build it ourselves, it's a big win. So I think that's a critical point that you brought up for sure.
Yeah.
So I think another point you brought up, which was interesting, is, as people are developing software, a lot of times when they're developing automation scripts, they say on every check-in the developer does, it's slowing down the feedback they're getting because the automation scripts need to run. And so if someone's constantly committing to the main branch, it's just really hushing them mellow because they're not getting the feedback they need quick enough. So are you saying this is a pain point that a solution like this could help, where because you get able to scale up multiple environments, you're able to get the information faster and quicker?
Yeah. So the premise here is that for every branch, every pull request, an environment, which is a full stack, so everything front end, back end, databases, cloud native resources, can be created just on the branch that you're working on. So let's say you have 100 developers, you could have 100 environments all on separate branches. So there's no contention amongst the developers. Everybody has their own isolated copy where they could test, debug, run automation, preview. You mentioned that earlier in your intro, that previewing those features is also, especially in a larger org where you've got product, QA, design, everybody cares a lot about not just does it work, but what does it look like? Does it meet the customer need? And if you only have a few environments that you can use to do that, again, now those environments are locked up for that purpose. So by parallelizing that, eliminating that bottleneck, individual developers are never really encumbered. So the speed at which you can do that is at the speed of the parallelization that you can create with having basically an infinite number of environments. Now I think the most important part of that is making sure that it's integrated into the tooling. So as you're doing your work within your source control system, you want to make this super easy for the developer, right? The developer, these should just appear. They shouldn't have to go and know the infrastructure, know the scripting ecosystem that makes it happen. So I think a really key part of making something like this work is it integrates with GitHub, Bitbucket, or GitLab. So when you do a PR, that environment automatically gets created. And when you merge the PR, the environment automatically goes away because you've merged it into a higher order environment staging or multiple staging environments, whatever that might look like. So to the developer, you want that to be seamless. And as they push those changes, that environment is mirroring whatever the changes are locally. So you always have this ready and waiting test, preview, staging environment on that branch waiting for them.
Great. And you brought up something that really hit home with me. I used to work for a healthcare company, and so we had these really complicated environments. So we only had a few of them. And a lot of times it'd be one environment we test on, and the department would say, we're giving a demo to this who we're building this feature for, do not do any testing on it. And it always turned out someone would break something while someone was doing a demo. So it sounds like this is another user case for a service like this. Is that correct?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Demos, it's funny as an entrepreneur and founder, I end up having to do a lot of demos all the time. Yep. Customers, investors, whoever it might be. And having the ability to take whatever your production environment is, snapshot it, and do a demo completely off to the side that nobody can touch is the most valuable thing that I've derived out of release myself personally, because I don't ever have to worry about the developers going and breaking staging or production while I'm on whatever call or video or whatever I'm doing. So it's actually a use case that customers sometimes buy us for too, which is, hey, I've got a large sales organization where every salesperson, every SE, whoever it might be in their org, they can assign out their own environments to them so that they're not stomping on each other's toes. So demo capabilities, and that's any kind of demo. It could be, the way that I like to use them a lot is, we'll have customers that say, hey, I want this feature. And in the abstract, that feature is described by the customer like, hey, I want it to do A, B, and C. Well, a lot of times, until that feature makes it all the way out to prod, the customer never really sees it, right? It's like, okay, we're ideating on that. Maybe some wireframes. If a good product manager is really good, they'll pass it over, say, hey, is this kind of what you were talking about? But we actually a lot of times will take that change and give them one of our environments that we're doing that change on, preview it with the customer in the product development lifecycle, and iterate with them live, that feature live, so that by the time it makes its way to prod, we already know that it's meeting the needs. And it's not like, wait till it gets there. Oh, that's not right. Now go back all the way through the process again. It's like a real-time collaborative way to basically work directly with your customers on things that they might need along the way as well.
Great. And I just thought of another thing maybe help with that. I'm curious to know. When I worked for healthcare, at the end of a release, we'd have to freeze an environment. And so if someone came in to audit us, they'd say, not only do I want to see a test, but I see the environment you actually tested in without any modifications. So if anyone upgraded the browser or anything, that was a big deal. And so to keep an environment in that pristine condition was an issue. So are you able to do a snapshot like that and say, okay, here's the exact environment we tested on, and just have it come up on
every environment? I think a key part of an environment management, environments as a service system, is the ability to snapshot in time, what did the environment look like along with what did the code look like. So, and this actually rears itself in a case like you talked about, but other times it's just debugging, right? Like you have an issue that rears its head, it's some version of the state of the environment. When you go to test it, the environment isn't what it was when that bug existed. And you always hear, well, I can't reproduce this, right? Well, sometimes you can't reproduce it because the infrastructure, the configuration, whatever had changed. And so if you can go back to a moment in time where the environment looked like it did the time that bug existed, or in your case, making sure that for audits, it's exactly what it looked like, you have this ability to ensure that you're looking at exactly what was going on at the time that whatever issue happened, or the auditor can come in and look at it the way that it was when they needed to see it. So the snapshotting of moments in time is a really important part of this, so that developers, testing, quality, all of that stuff comes into play there. Infrastructure is kind of it's tough. So it moves in time and it's hard to move it forward and back. And so with an environment management system, you can do that.
I also think with infrastructure, a lot of times people don't realize just how critical it is, because they may think, oh, it's just a developer resource. But like you said, people are doing demos. You're making sales based on these environments. You're helping to not get an audit hit and have to pay money because you didn't follow regulations. So it's very critical for sure. So what do you think is the reason why? I think a lot of times people hear this, they go, oh, that's what Kubernetes and Docker is for. So what's your answer to that? Like, is this what this is? Is this just a Kubernetes type of solution? Tell me a little bit more about what release is and how it may be different than from Kubernetes, I guess, the better question.
I mean, Kubernetes is definitely an enabler to pull this off. Underneath the covers, we use Kubernetes to orchestrate Docker and containers. And there's a lot of really cool capabilities that Kubernetes brings to the table that allow you to pull this off at scale like we're doing. But the reality of an environment is container runtime engines like Kubernetes are one part of the equation. You still have data, you still have cloud native services. You might have Lambda, serverless, Kafka, you might have Elasticsearch, you might have all sorts of other componentry in and around your environment that if you're going to reproduce the environment, you got to reproduce all of it. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to reproduce the containers and that's enough. Much like what we just spoke about, right? You could reproduce the Kubernetes subsystem, but what if your database moved forward in time, or what if your Lambdas were different than the way they were when the actual test was running or when you were running your code? So the environment itself is a combination of the data, configuration, settings, all of the cloud ecosystem around it. Kubernetes is an enabler of this because it helps with the custom code and the runtime of custom code. And there's standard off-the-shelf things that you can bring in, like Helm charts and other things that help you build your application the way you need it. But I would say it's necessary to pull off what we're doing, but not sufficient. You have to have orchestration of all of the rest of it. And we're pretty fortunate that the world has evolved to a place where there's standards for things like Terraform so that you can spin up cloud native services, or AWS CDK, or whatever, Pulumi, whatever it is that you're using to do that. So release is a combination of integrating source control, Kubernetes, the ability to orchestrate data so that you have the right data in your environment, and then also the native services that sit around it, while mapping it to whatever your application looks like. You might have a monolith, you might have microservices. All of this complexity is really what makes up an environment. So yeah, Kubernetes is definitely an enabler, but if you don't think about all those other things, you're basically just recreating the containers, not creating the whole environment.
So interesting thing about the environments, I know a lot of people are going more cloud native, or they consume a lot of services that are third party. How does this help with that? If you're spinning up an environment, are you mocking it? Do you have like a service that you're kind of mocking so that it emulates it, or are you actually kind of how does that work?
We have customers that do it all sorts of ways. So some customers have mock services that they're using. Other customers, like for a shared service, say it's like a Stripe endpoint. If you're doing like integration with billing, they will have multiple environments pointing at the same shared external resource, even though they have multiple copies of their environment. And then other companies will actually create snapshots of those shared services if that shared service supports it. So like, what's a good example of that we were just working on the other day? We were working with a company that was Shopify instances, right? Like they need multiple Shopify instances because they couldn't have them shared, so they needed to create them. We also did an integration with LaunchDarkly, which LaunchDarkly has the concept of environments as well. It's a shared service, like all the environments wanted to point at one LaunchDarkly, but we created this integration that allowed every environment to get a copy of a LaunchDarkly environment, so all the feature flags got copied in. So it's a bit of a like conversation or a decision that every customer needs to make, is like, what do you want to do with these shared resources? Sometimes spinning up separate copies of them isn't financially the right decision either, right? Like if you're, like for instance, if you were going to spin up a Salesforce sandbox instance, that might cost you, and I'm using my memory from my days back at TrueCar, I think it cost us like $75,000 a year to have another Salesforce sandbox instance. So in that case, it wouldn't make sense, obviously, to create a new snapshot of that every time. So that might need to be a shared resource. So it takes some thinking about all of these things along the way. And that's part of what we help with when we bring a customer on is, we do a quick call, we talk about all their services, and then we say, okay, here's the way we think we can do it in the most cost-effective way to try to get them, those services in a way that works for their testing needs.
Nice. I see such a need for this. I'm just thinking back when I worked for a healthcare company. One issue, though, is this might sound stupid. How do people know what their environment should be? Because a lot of times that we build environments and not even realize, we consume this cloud service, or we use this because there's some expert way down the hall that no one talks to that always goes rogue and installs it without anyone knowing. Does this solution help them? Like, can you sniff an existing environment or anything like that?
Yeah, like the first part of the bring up of an environment is we analyze their existing repositories that make up their code bases. And within that, you're going to find all sorts of clues: Docker files, package.jsons, Helm charts. All of these dependencies are kind of lingering throughout the environment. And so we look at that and say, okay, based on what we found, here is the template that we think defines your environment. Now, sometimes that's not completely right. Obviously, if some guy down the hall is doing something that we don't know about, the way that generally our customers will find that out is when you bring up a release environment for the first time, you're bringing up a snapshot outside of your existing environment ecosystem. And it's either going to work or it's not. And usually what we see is that environment comes up and it's kind of in like an 80% working state. And actually the process of trying to bring up your environments in release helps you figure out what dependencies are you actually using. And a lot of times, like you said, we'll run up against customers who are like, I didn't even know we were using this. And it's within that process of recreating that environment for the first time that they discover those. And then what they do is they add those into the template. And now they actually have a definition of their environment that's a gold standard. And it's very, very rare for us to come up against a company who actually has a full infrastructure as code defined, ecosystem. It's. I don't think in the entire time we've been working on this for 3 years, we've ever seen a company that's like everything is codified within a single configuration. There's lots of configurations. All of them have to work together, and many times they're missing things. And that process of taking that and putting it into an environments as a service system, actually is the first time that they'll ever really get to a place where they've codified and have it all in code like everybody speaks that you should be doing now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, once again, from personal experience, it's almost like automated documentation for your environment. So 2 examples come to my mind is we'd have to list out dependencies of our application, but it was all like just an email. Hey, just send us what dependency you're using. We had to list them out, but come on, yeah. I don't know how much we could rely on it. This is much more reliable, much more auditable. And also we had an application and we used third-party apps within the company. And we'd have like 60, 100-page documents of how to install this third-party app in order to test our integration between the two. This sounds like you could just spin up an instance of that particular third-party app.
At the end goal of this is you should be able to click a button and an entire environment is created. And so in the process of doing that, like I said, you'll sniff out like, okay, here are the things that we don't have codified. Here are the things that are dependencies. And in order to make a system where you can click a button and your entire environment comes up, you need to declaratively define that somewhere. And that's what we call the application template, which is a core part of what we offer. Now you have a fully defined, environment definition. You click a button, you can create a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, however many you want from that point forward.
So I'm just thinking of all the scenarios that this could help with. Another one that just came to my mind, not sure if this is what it helps with. Site reliability engineering has been big. And if you know, probably last year, which is just like a few weeks ago, AWS went down like 2-3 times. So Hulu, Netflix, all these Twitch all went down. Can you use this almost to do like experiments? Like what happens when AWS goes down? How does it fail over? Can you use this type of a solution to help you kind of do these type of experiments as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can have separate environments that you spin up. They're going to have the same dependencies, and you can mock out or experiment within this environment. Like what happens if this dependent service goes down? What happens if that dependent service goes down? And the nice part is you're doing it in a throwaway environment. So if you completely screw everything up and hose everything, you're not impacting anybody else, right? You're just messing it up yourself and realizing, okay, we're highly dependent on AWS or we're highly dependent on GitHub or whatever it might be. So now I can work on that problem without impacting anybody else. And usually a lot of that can only be really done within a shared staging environment because it's the only place where all of those connections and dependencies are created, because it's really hard to define all of those. So within release, if you define those dependencies, now you can go play around with shutting those off, turning them back on, see what happens to your application, and you don't impact anybody else. So it's a really, really good tool to kind of do chaos engineering, if you want to call it that, where you break things, see what happens, keep breaking it until you get to a place where it's more reliable. Then you bring those changes into your main environments, and you're much more resilient after that.
Nice. So I always say this on the podcast. I love speaking with vendors' solutions because you work with a lot of different customers. I think a lot of times developers are stuck in their own little world within their application, don't realize all these other things. So curious to know, can you give any examples of maybe someone that didn't have your particular solution in place, what it was like, and then what it was like after? Do you have any type of case studies or anything like that?
Sure. A lot of the companies are, this single staging environment problem, especially as the engineering headcount grows, it just slows product velocity. And so you'll have customers, one of my favorite, I won't say exactly who it is, to spare them, said to us like, hey, the way that we test our code, and the other thing about this job is we find nobody's really truly thrilled with the ecosystem that they've created. There's always like some sort of like, hey, I got to explain this thing that we do, and it's kind of embarrassing, right? And so this particular company was like, you won't believe this, but we're literally testing all of our environments on MacBooks. We have 6 environments set up on MacBooks in our office. And the only way that we can really test all of this is to push the code to master or main, and then QA person, developer walks over to one of these MacBooks, they pull it down, and they do their testing there because it's too difficult to get everything running in the cloud, so that's the way we do it. So they were literally buying MacBooks on a monthly basis to keep up with this. And obviously, not the most ideal scenario in the world. Data was a big problem there, where getting snapshots of the data to do testing, there was an engineer who had to show up at like 5 a.m. in the morning and refresh all of the environments, the laptops. I'm using a pretty extreme example here, but it's a really funny one. That person has to come in every morning at 5 a.m., update 5, 6, 7, 8 MacBooks so that the developers that day had the most fresh data. So in their world, it was incredibly manual and incredibly expensive because they had people buying laptops, setting them up, putting them in their ecosystem. And when they started using release, obviously automation of all of that, eliminated the need for any of these manual processes that they had completely, and freed them up essentially across the board to do faster QA, faster deployments. The velocity improvement is normally the biggest thing that you see when you introduce an environments as a service system. Another great example, at TrueCar, when we were there, we were deploying like once every 8 days before we built our own version in-house. And by the time we were done with building out our own internal version of that, we were deploying hundreds of times a day. So generally, the ability to have infinite compute in AWS was designed to help everybody go fast, but you have to have the tools, something like release or something you build in-house in order to harness it.
Absolutely. I know you mentioned data a few times. I know for test automation testers, that's critical. Using a solution like this, I assume you could have like a golden copy of the data. So every time you spin up the environment, it's in a known state. You run your tests, you muck around, you close it down, you don't save those changes. So you always have a clean copy, which is going to help you debug and run tests quicker, better, faster as well, I would assume.
Yep, that's all a part of, whether it's us or any other solution that you might put together. Those golden copies, scrubbed copies, free of PII, depending on if you're in a privacy, laden environment where you can't let developers see production data, we're able to take a snapshot of any data set and bring it in. We call it instant data sets, so that when the environment comes up, it instantly attaches to a library. You can have a library of data sets. And so you might have a performance data set, you might have a prod replica copy. That one happens a lot. Like if you're doing a massive database migration, you might actually want a prod snapshot in your developer environment because you're making major changes to the database that you can't approximate with a seed data set, right? You have to have a real copy. So we're able to take a snapshot of any data set and bring it into these environments through a thing we call instant data sets that allows those data sets to come up instantly. The environment comes up, attaches to a ready and waiting data set within the library, and now you can do any testing that you want to do within those environments. It's actually, if you look at the equation of getting a good environment there, you have your code, you have your infrastructure. Data is a really, really critical part of that equation. Yep. So it's something that we spent a lot of time focusing on, making sure that data is readily available.
Yeah, that just there, if you're a tester, I mean, having an environment like this is a game changer for sure. Also, you mentioned something about performance. It's just something flashed in my head. A lot of times we're trying to shift activities sooner in the software development lifecycle, performance being one of them. But to have it on a check-in is usually impossible because it takes so long to do, or you're gonna crash some other service. Once again, I assume because this environment's it's on its own little world. You can do that and not slow down the check-in because you have it spun up and running as quickly as possible.
Yep, and within that template, the other thing that's really cool is you can scale out the services. So you might have your developer environments. I'll use a simple example here where you have one replica of your container just to make it so I can test everything. Well, when you go into testing for performance, you're going to want to scale that out. You're going to want to see how far can I push this before I start to see bottlenecks in my ecosystem. So within that template, you can easily go in and say, oh, I want 5 replicas, I want 10, I want it to auto scale so that you can start running Siege or whatever tools you use against that environment that's isolated, scale it until it breaks. And so you can kind of see where your limiters are, and you don't touch staging, you don't touch your QA environments. You can do this as a developer, which that's generally really hard because the definition of an environment, if it's left in the hands of the DevOps team or whatever, in order to get that kind of test set up, there's lead time in order to get that, kind of isolated for me, or a separate version of that I can go run against, or I got to check out staging so nobody else touches it while I'm doing it. This kind of pushes that left, where as a developer, I'm thinking about building my code. Where are the bottlenecks going to be? You can easily add those kind of statements into the environment template and test it all you want without impacting anything.
Great. So I guess the only downside I've heard, I mean, I don't know how you do modern software development without a solution like this, but one thing I heard is a lot of times the costs associated with something like this, because you're running tests quicker and fast, but teams start to do more and more tests, and that the time you're using AWS in the background starts coming more and more, so that in the end it's still millions of dollars a month or whatever. So
AWS always wins.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any thoughts around that? How does this give you cost savings? I mean, obviously it gives you cost savings because things run quicker, but any downside of people overusing it or take?
Yeah, one of the ideas of what we call ephemeral environments is they disappear. So if I do a pull request, I spin up an environment. Like we get this question a lot. Well, what if my developer just creates a PR and doesn't touch it, right? Yep. It's just going to sit there. There's a time to live on the environment. So if they're not being used, they're automatically going to shut themselves down after a period of time. There's also cost savings things that you can do when you set this ecosystem up by helping the customer with, hey, should I buy an RI for this? Should I use spot instances? If you're building this yourself, all of those things are concerns that you're going to have to think through. And when you take an environments as a service system out of the box, like we're contemplating all of those things all the time. Because on one hand, we're giving you this ability to create infinite environments, right? Like parallelize your software development. But on the other hand, if you have infinite environments, AWS gets really happy because the bill goes up. So it's a really, really core part of what an environments as a service platform does is help you understand like, oh, okay, if I'm going to have these environments out there, how long should they live? What is the policy essentially around how many of those environments you can cap it, put a limit on it so you can limit your bill. You can have them automatically destroyed after a period of time after no usage. That whole idea of like cost savings there is really, really important. It's a very powerful tool, but you're right. If you don't carefully watch the spend, you could come back and be like, wow, that was way more expensive than I thought. So a lot of the things that we built into the product help mitigate any of those kind of out of control ideas. And we help customers figure out what the budget for this needs to look like on the compute side. You're trading off time and money always in this world. And if you want to move fast, it usually costs you a little bit more money. And it will to have infinite amounts of environments. You just want it to be the minimum amount of money that it possibly would cost you. And that's what a good environments as a service platform like Release helps you do.
Very nice. So I have a weekly news show, and a lot of times I have a follow the money segment where I looked where companies are investing money. I think you actually got a round of funding at $20 million recently or something like that. So
yeah, we did.
Just curious, a little more, I guess. So you must have something investors are believing in you, pitching something. So what are you telling folks about Release? Sounds like a cool place to work. Are you hiring? Just a little bit more around what you're all doing over there.
I think it comes from, obviously, I've felt and dealt with the experience myself. So living the pain point is always incredibly helpful when you build something and you go raise money. But I think the thing that really got investors excited is when they go talk to engineering leaders about this problem. Almost universally, every engineering leader will be, yeah, environments are difficult. Like they're really, really hard. We spend a lot of time and money working on this, right? We're investing headcount, we're investing in software, investing in tooling, and we still don't have an ecosystem that allows us to move as fast as we want. So in the process of going out and talking to investors, they do their own work, and I think that was a key thing that came back. And our proof in the market, we're growing really quick. We need good employees to work here. So that led to why we needed to raise the money to keep up with the demand. And I think all of those things being true were the reason why investors got excited about it. There's also the use cases of a type of product like this. We talked about developer environments, ephemeral environments, staging. We have customers using us for production now, where they've realized that having a common ecosystem to do ephemeral development, staging, and then also deploy and manage your production environments is really useful and interesting. And then the other use case that we're seeing that's really amazing is once you can define your application. So here's my containers, my networking, my data, my cloud native services, and I can recreate that. B2B SaaS companies are consistently dealt with, how do I offer a product to my customers that it has a lot of security and privacy? And generally what ends up happening is the customer says, I need your software to run in my cloud account. So I'm a B2B SaaS company and I'm selling to someone and they're like, hey, I love your product, but all the data you need to process is in my AWS account. I need your software to run on premise or on cloud, whatever that might be. Now that we've been able to codify the environment, we can put that application of one of our customers into their customer's account. We call those private deployments or private applications. So that environment now is movable. I can move it. It's basically a virtualized version of their application where it can run in AWS, GCP, Azure, AWS GovCloud, or I want to deliver a single tenant version of that environment to my customer. I just put it into their AWS account and I can manage it just like it's an environment that I'm managing for myself. So I think the other thing that's really, really interesting about environments as a service is the use cases. Like there's just, environments are everything. Like your application doesn't run unless you have an environment. So if you can make that reproducible, it's kind of an endless set of opportunities. Now we have to be really focused as a company to go after that. But I think that's, another reason why this is a really, really interesting product and space that we're in.
Okay, Tommy, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give to someone to help them with their environment automation infrastructure efforts? And what's the best way to find, contact you, or learn more about Release?
Yeah, I think the most actionable thing to do is really contemplate whether your software development life cycle is efficient. Because I think a lot of times people kind of sit on their laurels and say it's good enough because it's hard. Right? Like trying to go fix this yourself is a very difficult problem. We tend to find that a lot when we go talk to companies. It's like, hey, this is how we do it. It seems to work. But they haven't really thought deeply about, well, what if it looked like this? What if it was environments were ubiquitous? How would that change our ability to ultimately get products to our customers faster, which ultimately lets me grow faster? And I think people just kind of live with these non-effective ecosystems because getting out of it is really hard. And I think that was something, it took me a good 2 years plus to solve this problem at my prior company. And it took a lot of fortitude to go after it. Had a product existed in the market that could have shrunk that 2-year time span to a better world down to a month or 6 weeks, I would have bought it instantly, but it didn't really work. So I think it really is like, a question of engineering leaders to look at their ecosystem and not just sit there and say it's good enough because it is the way that it is. You got to envision this better state. And once you've envisioned that better state, you got two choices, build versus buy. And it's a waste of money to build it in-house. It just really is. So if you want to find out more about how we can help you guys with that, go to releasehub.com. You can email me directly at tommy@releasehub.com. I like to take emails and answer questions directly. All of those things are great ways to learn more about what we're doing. So that's the best way to get a hold of us.
Thanks again for your automation awesomeness. The links to everything and value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/A383. And while you're there, make sure to click on the Try for Free Today link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about Sauce Labs' awesome products and services. And if the show has helped you in any way, why not rate it and review it in iTunes? Reviews really help in the rankings of the show, and I read each and every one of them. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe. My mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Don't forget to subscribe to the Guild to continue your testing journey.